Okay. Okay, so I guess we're from all over the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. So welcome to this, it's an online workshop, which is part of a research project titled The Philosophical Approach to the Vaishnava Concept of God. My name is Alan Herbert. I'll be chairing today's session, the first session. We have another one later today, and we have a third one tomorrow. Myself, who am I? I'm a co-director of the project along with Ricardo Silvestre and Benedict Gurka. And before I go any further, I'm having technical issues here. I'm in India and the power's going on and off, and I have a UPS that's supposed to keep it going for a little longer than it has been. So if it goes off for more than 10 minutes, I might just disappear and then I got to come back in again. So I apologize if that happens, but hopefully it will hold out. Hopefully. So before I get to the workshop, this workshop, and to introduce today's first speaker, let me give you a brief and hopefully informative, and I'm aiming for painless too, introduction to the project itself. So let me just tell you who this is from. So first, it's a bit of a mouthful. The project has been made possible through a small project grant from the John Templeton Foundation, awarded through the Global Philosophy of Religion project, hosted by the Birmingham Center for Philosophy of Religion, that itself is run out of the University of Birmingham. It is also being hosted by the Brazilian Association for the Philosophy of Religion in collaboration with the Logic and Religion Association, LARA. So now we're coming to the end of this project. It's been running for the last year and a half or so, and this is the second of its two workshops. The previous one gave authors our Routledge edited volume on Vaishnava Concepts of God a platform to discuss and possibly develop their ideas for their chapters. So Routledge had told us they'll publish this volume before the end of the year. So the present workshop is on a similar theme to our Sophia Journal special issue, which will be published in early 2024. And so this conference and the special issue deal more with the general theme of concepts of God in Indian traditions, in general, rather than just Vaishnavism. If I can briefly explain something about the project to give you as an orientation. So the seed of this project was sowed at least a couple of years ago by way of asking a question that a few of us were asking, namely that what is God like for Vaishnavas? In other words, what is their concept of God? This question illuminated a problem, which is that many of the different practitioners of many of the Indian traditions, including Vaishnavism, either hold different concepts of God or are unable to properly define their own concept of God. So this not only seemed like a fertile area of research for us, but also there is very, very little out there that even addresses this particular and important issue. So it should be noted that our underlying research question, what is a concept of God for this Indian tradition or that Indian text, or what is God like, is not about a description of God as Vishnu, Narayan, Krishna, Radha, Shiva, Durga, Parvati, Nrsimha, Buddha, whatever, or whoever. And that this particular form has these features, X number of arms and possibly Y number of alternate forms or avatars and so on. We're asking a more fundamental question, namely, in what way does each tradition conceive of God as God? Whether this concept seems monotheistic, panentheistic, monistic, something else, or even if it's a concept of God that is a straw man or a part of a nominalist outlook. So although the concept of God has traditionally been approached by analytic scholars in the philosophy of religion and those of Abrahamic traditions through outlining God's attributes or properties, we're not avoiding, nor are we limiting ourselves to this approach. Our guiding question is whether God or God with attributes can be conceived adequately, whether in this tradition or in that text. Even if this is minimal, the God can be adequately conceived minimally, then we have at least a concept of God. If God cannot be adequately conceived, in other words, if there are contradictions or if that which we have conceived is insufficient, for instance, then we have a problem. So the challenge for any tradition is to hold and to promote an adequate and consistent concept of God. Otherwise, it would seem that they don't know what the God they're addressing, accessing, or worshiping is like. So back to this conference. It's the end of my preamble. So in the 3 sessions of this workshop over today and tomorrow, we have a variety of very interesting presentations. In the first session today, we have Jessica Frazier from Oxford University speaking on Beyond Theism, Vedantic Images and Arguments for a God Beyond Being. Next, we have Bindu Puri from Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, speaking on Gandhi on God, debating the Purva Paksha. And we have Itamar Theodore from Zafat Academic College, Israel, speaking on the concept of God in the Bhagavad Gita, a personalistic approach. So the presenters already know they have a maximum of 40 minutes, which includes discussion time. We suggest the presentation should last 20-25 minutes, which will allow for an extra 15-20 minutes for comments and questions. If there are questions, comments, or issues that you want to bring up during the discussion periods, as always, raise your virtual hand and we will try to get to you before time is up. If we do run out of time, then bear in mind that we might have a wrapping up session at the end where we'll all hopefully get another chance. So also please mute your mics to allow for a smooth presentation. So with nothing further for me to add, we can begin with our first speaker. So Jessica, who lectures at, Jessica Frazier, lectures at the University of Oxford in the faculties of religion and philosophy. Her expertise is in philosophical dimensions of Beta Vedanta and also Western approaches to ontology with a focus on Gadamer and the German phenomenological tradition. Her publications focus on ontology and the ethics that arises from it and conceptions of self, reality, and the divine. She's well published and well liked. So she'll be speaking on Beyond Theism, Vedic Images and Arguments for a God Beyond Being. So over to you, Jessica.
Okay, thank you so much. And just to check, I should finish about 8:40, is that right?
I have a different...
Sorry, 8:40 here. In 30, basically, is it 40 minutes or 30 minutes?
So it's 8:10 there. So yeah, 40 minutes makes it, 8:50 actually.
Something like that. Okay, something like that. Okay, perfect. That's really helpful. Thank you. Well, first of all, hello, everybody. And this is the beginning of the day here. It's very exciting. It's kind of a robust beginning to the day. Nice to see everyone there and to start off immediately into thinking about these big questions. I'm going to try and talk briefly about some work that I've been doing. It's really kind of a work in progress, but to explore the philosophical dimensions of the concept of Brahman. That's kind of where my interests lie, and in a way always have been. So I was invited by part of this Birmingham philosophical philosophy of religion project to think about Brahman in a philosophical way some time ago, and that produced an article that I did on monism, quote unquote, in Indian philosophy. And I really appreciated in that article having the chance to go back into scholastic material from around the time of Shankara. So Shankara, Srinivasa, who's a disciple of Nimbarka, and Bhaskara, and think about what actual concrete philosophical arguments they were giving for the nature of Brahman, to really treat this as philosophical theology. And not philosophical theology, to treat it as philosophy. So Brahman not only is the divine, but Brahman is the ground of being, as something that whether or not you're religious, whether or not you're Vedantic, whether or not you're interested in the religious side, is just actually an extraordinary and perhaps very strong argument for there being a fundamental ground that we all can take seriously in that sense. And in some ways, I'm interested in that for a variety of reasons, because I'm interested in the philosophy of being, but also because I think then as now, it was an argument that was meant to span a kind of a sacred secular divide. So that these are arguments that a lot of Vedantins develop precisely, as we'll see, in the sections of the Brahma Sutra. Ooh, my video is doing strange things. Can you guys still hear me? Yes, okay, the image is going completely bonkers, which is exciting, but that's fine. Or at least it is in the one. And do you see me looking normal? No. I can't tell. No, it doesn't matter. Okay, it doesn't matter. All I can see is my screen going completely crazy. But if it's as funny for me as it is for you, for you as it is for me, then that works out. Okay. Oh,
it's fine. We can hear you. We can hear you, which is the main thing. So
okay, that's good. Well, I'll keep going. And every once in a while, it may turn into a comedy cartoon session, so that's fine. Bit of entertainment in the morning. So part of what interests me is these are arguments that get made by scholastic Vedantic thinkers precisely in the parts of the Brahma Sutras that are aimed at Sankhya. And Sankhya here is making arguments for a secular conception of the ground of reality, pradhana. And they borrow those arguments and they use them to argue for Brahman. And there are reasons they want to say this is more than just a secular matter. But what's interesting to me in a way is that everything kind of here they're dealing with they're trying to bridge the gap between religion and secular philosophy. And I think it's useful for thinking about that issue now, right? So I think that 2000 or more years later, this is still actually a really helpful contribution to that debate. So there are going to be arguments that I want to think about in terms of specifically the philosophical nature of Brahman and why one should think that there is such a thing. And I'm going to position this in relationship, on the one hand, to philosophical debates about foundationalism, about whether the universe has a kind of a strong ground, a structure that is the basis of everything, which is still a contemporary ongoing debate. And I'm going to position it in relation to also, I think, beyond being the issues of ontotheology that Heidegger raised, what it means to think about the ground of reality, not just as another being, but as something, or even just as matter. So this is relevant to pantheism, but to something that grounds and is more fundamental than all of that. Okay, so let me jump into this a little bit. I'm going to share screen and just take you through some material that I've been looking at and really present some of the ideas at the end. Now, share screen might be a problem if my video goes wrong, so we'll see how that goes. But I'll share screen and I can talk us through what's there in any case. So let me start slides. Screen sharing. Here we go. Slideshow. Come on, slideshow. There we go, from the beginning. Okay. So, call this the pattern of all things. And again, my interest is more in the philosophical dimension of Brahman than in the personal dimension of Brahman. And that's part of my interest in Veda, particularly actually the early foundations of it. And I want to think about Vedanta as philosophy. So, Brahman as a philosophical idea, is it striking how little work there really is on that, I think, in some ways. There are so few books that have the word Brahman in the title, for instance. It's almost as if there's this huge lacuna, this huge hole at the heart of a lot of traditional, just the whole tradition of scholarship on Vedanta. Apologies that here a lot of the diacritics are missing just because my computer was having trouble with putting them into a PowerPoint. So forgive me for the lack of diacritics in places. But the core is that I want to talk about Brahman as a philosophical idea in a way that relatively rarely has been done. I'm interested in looking at that as well beyond just Advaita idealism. And of course, Advaita has received the majority of the interest, I think, from the philosophical world and probably from scholars in general. But also beyond theism. So much philosophical work has been done on Brahman as a theistic idea, and particularly focusing on Vishishtadvaita. Of course, there's also a lot on Achinti Veda. But in a way, there's still relatively little that looks at Brahman just in itself, beyond the idealist or beyond the personalist side of it. And I put beyond, but also beneath. And in a way, I look at arguments here that are used for both Advaita and the theistic schools. So we've got something that's a kind of a philosophical foundation for thinking about Brahman, regardless of which direction you want to take it in metaphysically. The idea is that the Upanishads provide all kinds of exciting models for metaphysical ways of thinking about Brahman. They rarely make arguments. I'll look at something that I think is an argument in the Upanishads, but they provide these images and models that then kind of move forward and compete, if you like, for the most explanatory power. So rather than arguments in the Upanishads, they're often providing explanatory pictures and then kind of throwing them into the marketplace, if you like, of discussion to see which looks best. But what's interesting to me here is where we begin what we call a sutric shift to dialectical argumentation. So particularly where the Sankhya-Karaka and the Sankhya-Karaka, I guess, and also Vaisheshika and Abhidharma together start to get into interrelated debate. And this feeds into the Brahma Sutras. So you get that wonderful thing where, particularly, I think in book 2 of the Brahma Sutras, there's a reflection explicitly of debates between first Sankhya, so it proposes Sankhya arguments for pradhana. It borrows the arguments, but it also opposes the idea that Brahman could be merely a prime matter, and then moves on to try and counter Vaisheshika, then Abhidharma, then Yogacara, then Madhyamaka. So we see a very clear, explicit shift towards dialectic, positioning yourself in relation to others, and towards explicit arguments. And what I want to look at is how they produce arguments for what we could think of as a single substance. And in this, as I've just written something on this, it looks a lot like Spinoza. So a single substance to which all the changing properties of the world adhere. Also, a single cause that is coherent across all reality and continuing and sustaining all things throughout. And a single power, the notion of something, sorry guys, something that is constantly powerful and effectively showing its impact throughout the world. And also, in some sense, a single context for ideas of the forms or shapes that things take. So we've got different ways of thinking about Brahman here that are to do with substance, to do with causation, to do with powers and telos and pattern, and to do with ideas. Okay. Now, I'm also interested in the philosophical kind of methodology of trying to generate theories, philosophical ideas that are fresh and new and relevant from old and existing philosophical debates. Right, and we can see that happening in all kinds of places recently, which I think is a really wonderful thing. There's a move toward taking these debates seriously as sources of ideas that we can use in contemporary philosophy. And we can see that in the work of people like Jan Westerhoff, The Non-Existence of the Real World, where he uses Madhyamaka and the work that he's done in the past on Madhyamaka to produce a position just in philosophy more generally that engages with contemporary work and is coherent and whole, regardless of which culture and which era you present it in. And in a way, Janardhan Ganeri has done the same thing with the idea of self, and Arindam Chakrabarti has done the same thing with regard to Nyaya and realism. And got other books there as well, Janardhan and Ramprasad, again, developing pure philosophical theory out of Indian material. So I'm interested in how these arguments for Brahman speak to these larger debates about the world. And really, in some ways, my great interlocutor here is seeing how the arguments for Brahman used by Vedantins really speaks directly to the skepticism that you see in Abhidharma, Yogacara, and ultimately Madhyamaka as well. So in some ways, my colleague here in Oxford, Jan Westerhoff, is kind of my debate partner in this. I'm interested in how he argues for radical anti-foundationalism, the idea that there's really no specificity to things, there's no basis for anything being what it is, there's no foundation ontologically or metaphysically for the world. There's nothing at the bottom, as it were. The whole word that's used for Brahman so often in Vedanta, adhisthana, that on which something stands, is precisely what is being denied in Madhyamaka and also in the contemporary versions of it, the anti-foundationist versions. But I'm interested in engaging with contemporary philosophical debates for foundationalism, for the idea that there does have to be something fundamentally grounding to the world. And we see this in a lot of contemporary philosophy, just to kind of wave to it, as it were, before we move on to Vedanta. So there's a lot of thinkers who are engaged in grounding debates today. Kit Fine, Ted Sider, Catherine Bennett has done some interesting work, Jonathan Schaffer, who we'll come back to, Kelly Trogdon. There's a list of people who are trying to understand what we mean when we talk about things being grounded in other things, and things being ultimately grounded at the foundation in something which is, if you like, the foundation of everything. And that could be more than one thing, or that could be one thing. Those who think it's one thing at the ground of everything are sometimes referred to as monists. So you could also refer to them as foundationists. And monism here doesn't mean, Jonathan Schaffer makes a nice distinction between monism, which says everything is literally one object, one concrete object. Almost no one has ever held that in any history because it's kind of absurd. What's usually meant here is what Jonathan Schaffer calls priority monism. There's one foundation. there's one ground, ultimately ontologically. There are ways in which even Thomas Aquinas in the Western tradition holds this, that if God as the ground disappears, everything else disappears, because everything remains ontologically, fundamentally grounded in every way in that one underlying thing. And we see this in the work of people like Michael Della Rocca, who's written on how Parmenides develops arguments for this, out of something he calls ontological vagueness. Jonathan Schaffer is perhaps the most popular contemporary philosophical representative of monist arguments, and we'll come back to that, but also Terence Horgan and Maciej Piotrowicz, who also work on the ontological ambiguity argument. And Dean Zimmerman has been part of this debate. He's interested in Western philosophy of religion, but a lot of what he does is relevant to what's going on in Vedanta as well. So there are debates about foundations, debates about kind of the unity of being, that are already there waiting for Vedanta to kind of speak to them. And I think the other debate this relates to is what I think of as the redefinition of substance. So that there are debates about powers and the new Aristotelianism, the idea that instead of a substance or stuff at the bottom of reality, we should think in terms of an array of powers. Fits nicely with debates about Shakti in the Vedantic tradition. And indeed, perhaps one single complex power that expresses itself as a field, if you like, that moves through space-time and provides all the kind of modal constraints, all the forms and shapes and determinations that we see manifesting around us as things and laws of nature. And of course, the beyond being debate, so what it is to speak about a God beyond being, which comes out of the Heideggerian tradition and others. And I've engaged with that in relation to Gadamer and interested in that in relation to Deleuze. So in some ways, I want to look at the Upanishadic Brahman as the basis of a kind of an Indian pantheism, however you want to put it. And I'm interested particularly in the Chandogya Upanishad, partly because it sets up the notion of a sort of a single unity from which things arise. It's one of the main sources for language about adhishtanas or foundations in the Vedantic tradition. And particularly, of course, famous verse 614, which comes up again and again, where it speaks of Brahman almost as a kind of a clay under which all things, or from which all things are made, and which you can identify and see under all things if you learn to understand it properly. Everything else is merely a verbal handle, vacharambanam, a name, namadeyam. Well, the reality, the sat, is just clay. And of course, that enters the Vedantic tradition of discussion, debate, and dialectic, partly through the Brahma Sutras, where it's referred to explicitly. Most people feel that's what it's referring to in 2.114, which is going to be a key text because actually that single verse provokes some of the most rich and detailed commentary from almost all the scholastic thinkers thereafter. But the other source, which isn't always kind of recognized, is that actually Samkhya has a huge impact on how these arguments unfold. So that in fact, I kind of want to argue that the Brahma Sutras Brahman is also kind of a Samkhya Brahman. They argue against Samkhya because of Samkhya's inability to account for efficient causation in the idea of a pradana, a prime material of everything. But they use its arguments. So Samkhya Karaka, verse 9, uses an argument for why there must be property, a pradana underneath everything. We know that the effect exists prior to its visible appearance already in the underlying material cause, because of non-being not being a cause, from grasping that there must be a material cause, what generally is, from it not being the case that everything comes to be, and from a thing's own capacity's power to do what's possible to it, and from the existence of causes. And it goes on and kind of unpacks this a bit further in Samkhya Karaka 14 to 17. Now, what's interesting here, there's different things going on here, which are there are actually different arguments embedded in here. An argument from the impossibility of spontaneous arising, with arguments from the idea that properties have to adhere to a substance. There has to be something underneath. Those are arguments that Buddhists in some Vaisheshika might even argue against. But I think that one of their master arguments that is really significant here is the one that I've highlighted. From it not being the case that everything comes to be, there must be a foundation to things, right? And this is an important argument. So Sarva sambhava. So it's not the case that all things come to be. This points to a kind of modal order of the world. And here I'm using the arguments as Shankara puts them. It's kind of ironic that Shankara makes these arguments because he doesn't really want to argue that Brahman is, in this sense, the foundation of the empirical world that grounds and generates and creates coherence for it. Because later, of course, he's going to want to say that the empirical world is Maya and ultimately separate from Brahman. And yet at the same time, he makes these arguments because they're some of the best arguments against the Buddhists and Vaisheshikas, the pluralist thinkers who think that the world is grounded in a range of separate things. Shankara makes his argument for modal order using effectively that argument from the Sankhya. So he says, when from one combination, another emerges. He's talking about Vaisheshika and maybe Abhidharma. So if the world is really just created from combinations of things, then the world or the things we see would either be regularly similar. So if pratitya samutpada is the answer, and it's simply that things follow on from what came before, nothing would ever change. Things would just replicate themselves. Or things would randomly be similar or dissimilar. If there's no pratitya samutpada, then things would happen and come with absolutely no determination or pattern. Things would be a chaos. We'd see it kind of a static, if you like. If regularity be admitted, then a human body can have no possibility of being transformed into divine, worldly, or hellish bodies. And the point here is that if you have a kind of complete repetition in something like pratitya samutpada, then everything would stay the same. There would be no reason for things to develop. But if irregularity be admitted, then a human body may momentarily become an elephant or be transformed into a god or back into human form again. So that means if there's no order to the world, if something like Abhidharma is correct, and there's nothing that's shaping the world as a single coherent pattern or causation, then a human body may momentarily become an elephant or be transformed into a god or back into a human form again. Anything could happen at any moment. He says both views contradict the position. So he's arguing here against pluralism. And in a way, he's not so much arguing against pratitya samutpada as an idea that Buddhism uses to try and explain the coherence of the world. He's actually saying it's an inadequate theory. We need to explain why pratitya samutpada, some kind of pattern of the world, is there. There must be a unified directing force. And this is all kind of taken from an article that I did on monism and Indian philosophy. So this also is an argument that only recently, I almost don't think I've seen it anywhere in previous literature, and just in the last 12 years, I think he makes this argument for the first time in 2010. Jonathan Schaffer has made an argument for monism. He calls it the argument from free recombination. If there really were multiple basic independent units of being, so there's real completely separate things at the foundation of reality, as the priority pluralist claims, then these units should be, in Hume's words, entirely loose and separate. They should be freely recombinable in any which way. Any way the one can be, and any way the other can be, ought to become possible. So anything could happen. The world could be any way at any time. A disconnected pluralistic heap of pure dharmas or pure sort of anus in the Vaisheshika way, at the bottom of reality, wouldn't have any reason to develop in any particular way. So it should thus be amenable to free combination, and thus failure of free recombination is the modal signature of an interconnected monistic cosmos. That line means, because the world has a pattern, it's the signature of a connected monistic cosmos, he argues. And so in that sense, we've got Shankara's argument there, fitting very clearly with a particular argument that this person makes just about 10 years ago. And it doesn't really get made much in between in the Western tradition, but of course the Indian tradition develops it extensively as one of the most powerful arguments for there being Brahman as single foundation. Now I'm interested in Srinivasa, partly because the debates around Nimbarka and Srinivasa are very much about their sort of era, their dates this is very much in question. We don't know if they're basically right around Shankara, with Nimbarka coming just before Shankara, Srinivasa just after, or maybe later. You get both arguments being made. But it's kind of nice to put him into discussion with Shankara and with Bhaskara. As someone who's trying to argue here, in a sense, for a single unified reality, who's really interested in arguing for parinama, transformation, but who's also, as we'll see, really interested in arguing that even though he looks a lot like he's following the Samkhya idea of a kind of a non-divine stuff, he says this is explicitly more. So he makes an argument in the Vedanta Kaustubha, which is his commentary on Nimbarka's commentary on the Brahma Sutras, for the idea of material cause of things being really something that's identical with the forms themselves. So pots, plates, and so on have the lump of clay as their cause, bracelets, earrings have gold, foam waves have the sea, fruit, leaves, and so on have the tree. All of these things are forms of a single underlying material cause, kind of classic argument we see made many times. Bhaskara is the same. And at the same time, he also makes explicitly this argument, which I've called the modal argument. So actually an argument for the idea that if we see order in the universe, there has to be a single foundation. So in 114, his commentary on that same verse, he says, if things arose from non-being, it would happen that everywhere everything would arise and the function of agency would be obsolete. So again, here it's sarvatra sarvotpatti prasanga, the idea that you can't have everything arising in an ordered way without there being something to correct. And he goes further and he says, we don't think of this just as some cause in the background of things. Think of it as what he calls an impelling, ordering, immanent cause, something in which material causation, it's one with everything. Also efficient causation, the dynamic sort of movement of things, arising and movement of them, and formal causation, the specific pattern and template and plan of the forms they take have all to be part of a single thing. So he talks about prime matter as envisioned by Samkhya having no connection with the sentient principle, and therefore not being adequate for the production of effects, right? So it doesn't have the impelling and planning side of things in order. Whereas the prime matter of the Upanishads, Brahman, does. Its meaning lies in the goal of giving rise to all effects from primal material to a tuft of grass. So this idea that it shapes everything from the bottom to the top. And he talks about this in terms of the importance of there being a power. So the language of Shaktis, of course, is already there being developed very early in this material. Obviously, it takes on its own journey in the Puranas, but here we have a very technical sense in which, arising directly out of Samkhya, the language of Shaktis is being used to make sense of the order of the universe. And indeed, it presents Brahman as a transformative power. And in some ways, this is stuff we know about Veda. In some ways, though, I think it also brings out the sense in which Veda isn't just even at this early stage, is not just a clay, it's not just a substantialism, it's not a pantheism in the kind of negative sense that people sometimes attribute. It's really thinking of Brahman as a complex, ordered, self-transforming power. So not just stuff, if you like, not merely material. It causes its own transformation into the forms of the world through the projection of its innate and self-directed power. And this is where we get Parinamavada emerging. It's linked to this idea of the necessity for explaining the order of the universe. And of course, Bhaskara uses in exactly the same commentary on the same verse, 2.114, the one that refers back to the Chandogya Upanishad. He also says it has to be a self-transforming thing. And this explains why Advaita would be wrong. So it's actually a lot like Spinoza's God in some ways. And this just came up because I was asked to compare them recently. Spinoza being kind of the key template for thinking about what was called pantheism in the West. But pantheism is a word that has had a bad press lately. Really what he's talking about is he calls an indwelling cause, which explains the order of things. Nothing comes to pass in nature, he says in the Ethics, which can be set down to a flaw therein. Nature is always the same and everywhere one and the same in her efficacy and power of action. And that leads him to understand that there must be a single reality. Deus is omnium rerum causa immanens non vera transient. So he's not the thing that is a transient cause shaping the world, but rather the immanent cause becoming the world, motivating it from within. As Charlie Huneman puts it about Spinoza, from God's nature, all things have necessarily flowed with stark, raving, geometrical necessity. God is the productive core of existence. So I'm trying to pull this towards a kind of conclusion so I can leave some time for discussion. But in a sense, I want to look at how that, just think about how that goes beyond normal concepts of substance. And think about the foundation of reality more as a power, an active power, pure active power itself. And you even get a sense here, and ironically, this is an argument made by Shankara, that more than a power, it's also almost a field. There's another part of the grounding debate that says, what is it that is the ground for things having the forms and interdistinct identities that they do? What makes things able to be what they are? And Shankara always presents Brahman as this more semantic, more abstract conception of a field or foundation for reality as well. And here, this is 2.2.24, where he's actually attacking Madhyamaka, and he positions Brahman almost as the akasha, the pure field against which things exist. And interestingly, here he talks about the positive entity or the positive ground, the vastu, which allows a thing to be in a particular time and space in a particular time. But here, vastu doesn't mean dravya, it doesn't mean just a physical stuff. It means something actually much more abstract, much more semantic, but equally the thing that enables anything to even have its particularity or its specificity. So to sum up, we've got a picture, just trying to get a bit closer to the specific arguments that are made. And here's one particular one, I think, that turns into their master argument. There are other arguments that are important as well, but the one that's strongest against Buddhism is the idea that you wouldn't see any order in the world if there wasn't some shared foundation for everything. And even Pratiti Samutpada really doesn't do that work, and Madhyamaka even less is able to deal with it. So instead of an anti-foundationalism, the idea is that you see a kind of a sense of a foundationalist position developed back in the scholastic Vedantic period, which is still relevant today and actually hasn't been made very much, that there's a unified modal pattern to all things that represents a complex telic power that constitutes the world. And in a sense, also in a more abstract sense, provides the state space, as Ted Sider, the metaphysician, puts it, of all essences, of all identities, of the forms that each thing takes through time, moment by moment by moment, against which all particularities can be differentiated. And I just mentioned this to Jan Westerhoff with his anti-foundationalist arguments. He said, oh, so it's kind of foundationalism, but foundationalism light. And there are arguments, questions we can ask about what this represents Brahman as being. In what sense is it an entity? In what sense is it existence? In what sense is it something more fundamental than how we think of existence in the empirical world? The conditions of reality, the powers manifest in reality, the potential for there being pattern and identity. So as a philosophy of the divine nature, it really emphasizes God, insofar as we can know it from the world, as a kind of plan of pure dynamic telos, a multi-leveled reality. So not just what's at the bottom, not just the stuff we see, not just even the emergent forms, but the whole multi-leveled reality, from the invisible ground, if you like, to the emergent, complex, mental, cultural, all the higher level emergent forms that the world takes. It's almost like we need a new set of omni-characteristics of the divine. It's omni-creative, omni-form, omni-active, omni-telic, omni-emergent, omni-temporal reality that opens up the kind of vectoral space of the field on which the essences, the identities, the nama-rupas, names and forms of the empirical world can exist. It's kind of a canvas for the arts. It's the agent in the dance. It's the plot of all stories, if you like. And so really, it's just an attempt to look at what scholastic Vedanta has to say about Brahman in its most philosophical way of thinking about it, and to rethink a little bit how it defines divinity. And I guess I'm interested in the sense that where Samkhya makes very similar arguments, it's getting the arguments from Samkhya, but Samkhya doesn't want to say that Brahman is divine. There's a specific sense in which it says if you put all these arguments for Brahman together, you get something that is that really is extraordinary, that cannot be reduced to mere matter. And it, I think, applied to contemporary philosophy, metaphysics and ontology today, it says if you look at the ground of things, you can relate this to contemporary philosophy of physics, you do get something which can't be reduced to mere matter. It is really an extraordinary being in itself. I'll leave it there and just leave that picture of Brahman in the air.
Thank you very much, Jessica. It was really interesting. I never actually thought of it like that. It's the idea of a foundationalist Brahman that is also a power. It's fascinating. But okay, so I'm gonna turn it over for questions. We have a little time. Before, I'm gonna use my chair's prerogative to ask the first question, if you don't mind. It's just a basic thing. I'm trying to understand, because is there any, from what you explained, it's almost like there's a whole different way of looking at foundationalism, and just to see if there's any correlates with what's actually going on with standard views on foundation. Because a lot of foundationalist theories are Mariological, it's like parts to a whole type of thing. Whereas there's also the idea of fundamentalism, where you have ontological dependence relations and so on. And these all can be defined in different ways. So do we have a type of foundationalism whereby, because it's a power, so can a power, does it have properties? Does it have properties like dispositional properties? Does it have even categorical properties? Does it have, and how do these function? Are those powers ontological dependencies? Are they instantiated? How is there any correlates between your work and Brahman? Go on.
No, that's helpful. Yeah, thanks. Partly, just briefly, I think this is something where the whole grounding debate, the biggest issue is how to think about a ground, not just as a stuff. Adhisthana makes us think of a physical thing that things are grounded on. And of course, the whole debate is about trying to go, actually, our concepts so far aren't good enough to make sense of what we think of this thing as being. So I think it is kind of pushing past some of the existing language that we have. But I guess I'd refer us to, in the metaphysics of powers, which is a debate in contemporary philosophy. One of the big people motivating that is someone called Anna Marmaduran, who was at Oxford and has moved around. But she's edited a number of books on the metaphysics of powers. And she asks, what would it look like if it was foundation of reality? It was powers, not stuff, powers, not atoms. And I think a power is, how do properties sit in relation to it? There's a huge literature on this. But powers, in a sense, have a whole trajectory, not just individual powers, but the whole, if you like, development of the different specificities that things go through. So I don't want to use up the whole time, but it's not that it has properties, it's that a power contains and includes dialectically all the different specific forms that we think of as properties. But a property is no longer just that the tulip was green and now it's yellow. It's the trajectory, almost like the vector from one property to another. It's included within this overarching thing.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I see Ricardo has his hand up, so let's go over to that one. Ricardo, you're on.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much, Jessica. Very, very interesting talk. And I really appreciate your effort to, try to somehow explain or describe important aspects of Indian philosophy through some of those concepts that contemporary metaphysics not introduced, but they brought them back, like grounding, like ontological dependence, like fundamentality. So if I understood well your talk, you were kind of trying to do that. So that's really welcome. So I have two questions, very short ones. The first one is that because you speak about foundationalism, of course, but you also used a lot the word grounding. And at least a good part of your talk, you spoke about a kind of causal ontological dependence relation, right? Srinivas and so on. But usually contemporary metaphysicians, they make a very clear distinction. They say that grounding is not a causal relation. So I would like you to elaborate a bit on that. In which sense you're using the word grounding? I just wanted to understand that better. And the second question is that you mentioned Jonathan Schaffer, and you mentioned his argument from the free recombination, which he admits that might be used in favor of either priority monism or priority pluralism. And of course, he favors the first one. He's one of the main defenders of priority monism, the idea that the cosmos is the fundamental entity, which is a very wonderful idea. And some people, in particular, some people, I would mention here just Miri al-Bahari, she tried to connect this idea with Advaita Vedanta, because there is a kind of idea that Brahma might be taken as the whole of existence. So she tries to connect priority monism with that, and also another idea which is more connected with philosophy of mind, which is called cosmopsychism. So I'd like to know if you have something to say about that, because it seems to me that she's right in making the point that there is a very close connection between Schaffer priority monism and at least a common understanding of Advaita Vedanta.
Yeah. Just on the second one, I think I just agree. I think it can be used to argue for almost any form of ontological monism, whether it's consciousness that is the ground of the foundation, or whether it's powers or whatever. But what's important is that they would be doing the same work, right? So it's, of course, the arguments I took are from Shankar, and he's really happy to say that whether or not Brahman, in his own theological way of thinking, generates the empirical world, I think it puts him in a slightly difficult position, but he still wants to say that without Brahman, there would be no coherence to reality, because everything would be fundamentally determined by completely separate things with no interrelation or any basis for coherence. So that I think this argument is something that is used by all the Vedantists, whether they're Advaitic or whether they're Vedaitic. I think making this argument work with Advaita, strict Advaita, is more complicated, because Shankar wants to argue that Brahman does not, in fact, generate or really have much impact, causally or otherwise, on the nama-rupas that we see as the empirical world, right? It's adhyasa. So there's complications there, right? But yeah, I think in some ways the argument applies. And the grounding question, put it this way, when I had that example from Spinoza, the grounding, it's not a transient causation relationship. It's not a thing is here and this comes and causes it to do something. This is an immanent causation relationship, right? Whereas in a sense now, to cause is to have a disposition to become, right? And I think that sense that the Parinama interpretation of this, where what is happening is what I'm calling causation here is also material causation, formal causation, out of oneself as a disposition. It's a ground for the way that essences have their particularity. It's a ground for the order, temporally, of how they develop into, and having things develop in an ordered way is necessary for anything to even have an identity. If I didn't develop in an ordered way, you just have like random things and there'd be no reason to speak of Jessica being an entity. So if grounding can be many things, it can be constitutive grounding, it can be essential grounding, it can be metaphysical grounding. I think I mean all of those things, but I think I also mean something like modal grounding, which is something that Schaffer talks about as well, and other people do, that it provides, if you like, the constraints that shape the unfolding and indeed the identity of anything being able to be as it is. So yeah, I kind of want to go for all the various different kinds of grounding and say it's doing most of the different kinds of work that is spoken about in that debate. Maybe not all, but most.
Okay, I think looks like Ricardo's happy. We actually have no time. We should move on to the next speaker right now. Unless I can allow, is it Ruud Schurman? If it's a very, very short question, if Jessica doesn't need to go right now, we can do it super quick because we have to move on to respect the next person. So speaking. So
yes, I have a very short question. Jessica, in all that you're saying, I thank you very much. Interesting presentation. But as with most people that I hear talk about Hindu philosophy and so on, they tend to think of ways of grounding object of experience, the way we see the world, into other objects of experience.
Mm-hmm.
So more fundamental ones or universal one, but it remains object. And I think the whole point of all the Hindu and Eastern and Buddhism also is actually that it's not the object of experience is not grounded in another object of experience.
I agree. Yeah.
In the subject of experience.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, that's really helpful. And just briefly on that, I completely agree. And actually, that's why I think there's a different argument that Vedanta uses that doesn't work as well, where based on the Chandogya Upanishad, which says, look, the Nama Rupas we see, the changing ones, are based in the underlying thing we see, which is Brahman, right? So we can see the clay and we can see the bowl, but the clay is Brahman. And I think over time they realize that's a bad argument because you've reduced Brahman to being a kind of a visible stuff and you're still looking for properties that distinguish Brahman. I think this causation model is important for them precisely because it isn't about, it's purely as Sankhya puts it, anumanika, it's inferred, but it's not seen. It's trying to take them in that sense beyond the empirical. So yeah, maybe exactly how it succeeds and how it doesn't or what is missing is an interesting question, but I agree with you, I think this is an appealing argument precisely because it's trying not to do that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jessica. Very interesting. Everyone looks enraptured. That was very nice, very well presented. So we're gonna have to move on. I'm sorry, to the next person just to keep with the time.